A protagonist has to survive, right? I mean, a protagonist is the focal character of the whole story. They're the ones who guide us through the narrative, stumbling, learning lessons, or encountering threats. Sure, they might have many close calls along the way, but our protagonist is not going to go down until the very end. This is known as plot armor, a plot device where the focal character is so essential to the narrative that they cannot face a long-term incapacitation in story, like death or a coma. Usually a creator makes plot armor invisible to an audience because of in-story explanations, but even when there isn't, an audience will often suspend their disbelief to engage with the story. Superman can survive being shot with a laser due to his Kryptonian super abilities, so he doesn't have plot armor. Luke Skywalker doesn't have any explanation, so stormtroopers can't aim memes live supreme. Plot armor is especially fortified when a piece of media is named after the character. It specifies their importance to the story, that is, right up until the ending, where everything can go wrong. This is the last thing the character will do, so if they die, then that could be an ending to a story, even if it's not the ending an audience would want. Luke is essentially invulnerable when he encounters stormtroopers up until he encounters Darth Vader, at which point he's as susceptible to death as anyone in story, because these two were destined to confront one another in narrative, at which point the audience is tense in their seats, waiting to see if Luke will make it out alive. So while the audience is often tense at the final confrontation, the audience isn't tense for our character's survival for most of the story, since the audience knows that the character has an intended goal and cannot be taken out by anything until they reach that intended goal. Some media will use a decoy protagonist, where a character is introduced and we see their perspective thinking they're the protagonist, only for them to be killed off or incapacitated to let the audience know that this antagonist is a serious threat. Scream is an interesting example because so much of the marketing focused on Drew Barrymore as Casey Becker, so the audience went in thinking that Casey was the main character. Goes to show you the impact of advertising, people. And while the writer can use tension or red herrings outside of a decoy protagonist to convince the audience of permanent effects, typically these major characters are too important to remain afflicted beyond the current runtime and maintain that tension throughout the entire story. This leads to a disconnect between actual threats presented in story and the foreknowledge of the story building to a climax. Some stories might even view their protagonists as expendable. The characters themselves are important, but the philosophies and ideas they pass on, inspiring those after them, are. Stories may clearly doom the heroes from the very beginning. If we see characters struggle throughout and they end up dying, that can actually be more traumatizing to an audience instead. So to minimize his gut punch in a way that is more cathartic, the creator will show the ending of the story right at the beginning. Grave of the Firefly shows us two Japanese orphan spirits passing on, before showing us the journey of how they were trying to survive the bleakness of the Pacific War. Rogue One has a title crawl, expositing about this taking place before A New Hope. There's no plot armor here because we know how the story will end before it even begins. But there's a way to create tension in your audience throughout, making them feel cautious of every step any character takes, and the creator doesn't even need to establish the story's conclusion at the beginning. So let's talk about Pantheon. Pantheon is an animated sci-fi drama thriller based on several short stories by author Ken Liu. It focuses on Maddie, who receives cryptic emoji messages from a stranger online. Don't worry if you haven't seen season 2. This video is only going to talk about Pantheon season 1, so spoilers for that. While the first season focuses on Maddie, we have several other central characters, and the most important ones are introduced in the first episode. We're immediately introduced to a high school girl in Sacramento, and we get a title card, black screen with white font, Maddie. Keep this title card in mind because it's important. She's in class being bullied, and this isn't your typical shut up nerd sitcom bullying, but rather a more subtle kind, where she would recognize these actions are meant to intimidate and isolate her without being explicit to a casual observer. She runs out of the room trying to escape. Then we learn a lot more about her. She was super close with her dad, David, who was a highly experienced IT guy and died a couple years ago to an unspecified illness. She's not very close with her mom, and she's alone with no one she's comfortable enough to open up to. Then that night, she gets an anonymous message on her computer composed entirely of emojis. The messenger does not reply to her text responses, but only to emojis. The next day, there's technological chaos, and all of Maddie's bullies turn on each other because of misleading text and images. It turns out the emoji messenger is behind this, and Maddie finally feels like she has someone in her corner. That is, until her mom Ellen sees her daughter suspiciously speaking to a stranger online and intervenes. She speaks to the stranger much to the protest of Maddie, and Ellen realizes she knows who the messenger is. She gets on a call, and Maddie overhears her say, "Just tell me the truth. What have you done with my husband?" let's cut over to Saint Clement, where we meet another character, a pretty intelligent, emo-looking teen loner in math class interested in a new girl. He has a chat with her and has a bit of flirtation, and then we get hit with another name card, Caspian. So even though we met a number of characters by now, we know the two most important characters for us, the audience, to focus on are Maddie and Caspian. After he skateboards into the sunset, we're introduced to Caspian's parent, and we find out he doesn't have the best home life. His mom is timid, while his father is abusive and aggressive, so our super genius struggles with this dynamic. But the story suggests that there's more than what meets the eye with these three, because when Caspian isn't in proximity, his parents drop the facade and converse casually, with phrases like, "I had to improvise," or "give me the report." Our third and final major cut is to Dubai. We see an Indian businessman at a breakfast meeting with other businessmen, and we immediately get our third and final name card, Chanda. He's pitching the concepts of UIs, uploaded intelligence, where human consciousness is uploaded to the cloud. He's talking about how he's focusing on the innovation of UI, how uploading real humans onto a digital cloud would increase business output, and for humans to have an extremely early retirement. Someone sound off the capitalism exploitation bells! Then immediately after the meeting, he gets drugged and kidnapped. Now that's a general recap of episode 1 of the show. I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't. But the main thing is that we know our three major characters, Maddie, Caspian, and Chanda, based on the name cards during their character introductions. And they only get more interesting and more nuanced from here. And that's because Pantheon does an incredible job of making all these characters complex and like actual people dealing with crisis. Each of them have their own wants and dreams, their own goals and ideals. Yet, each of them have their own conflict of interest, even with the person who's close to them and even with the person who's on their side. As an example, the aforementioned UIs, or uploaded intelligence, is a central element to the show's narrative and a lot of its characters. One important character is David Kim, Maddie's dad, who died because of the aforementioned illness. In episode 2, Ellen, Maddie's mom, reveals that the messenger was actually her father, who was digitally uploaded and is now held hostage by the company David used to work for, Logarithms. So at the end of episode 2, Maddie and her mom both want to get back the technologically uploaded version of Maddie's dad, David. And even though both Maddie and Ellen want to get David away from Logarithms, they each have different reasons for why. Ellen wants this version of her husband back so Logarithms can't experiment and control the technologically replicated consciousness of the man she loved. Since she's already grieved David's death and is moving forward in her life, a technological being using the memories, ideas, and emotions of her husband can open old wounds for her and Maddie. She goes so far as to call this version of him a ghost of her husband. She doesn't view a consciousness living after a physical death possible, and a lack of physical and material presence means it isn't something that's living, but a false existence. Maddie, meanwhile, believes this technologically uploaded version is and could be her father. She's desperate for connection with him because her father was the only one who understood her and who she could talk to. Without him, she feels alone and isolated, especially given how she keeps getting bullied in class and her mom doesn't understand her. To her, just because David's now in a technological state means he's just switched in medium, but there's someone with his memories, emotions, and personality, and the version of him that she knew before he passed on. So both of these characters want the same thing and are actively working with each other, but have their own opinions and desires as to why they want the same thing. This adds an extreme level of nuance to these characters' relationships to one another and makes them all the more interesting than two characters that just straight up agree with everything each other's doing. But remember the title cards? They told us who we should follow as our main characters. We as an audience focus on how the secondary characters relate back to Maddie, Caspian, and Chanda. So when a character or story element outside of these three are developed, we see them as a fully formed person and are subconsciously thinking about how the nearest proximity focal character relates back to the story development. We take on the lens and biases of one of these three characters, which creates an additional level of nuance to viewing other characters. So when we hear about how Ellen wants to handle David's UI, we see her as extremely nuanced and complicated in the story through Maddie's eyes, since we're geared to take and sympathize with her perspective when she's on screen. Similarly, we get a bit more introspection to Caspian's parents in episode 3, where they talk about the importance of a hammer for Caspian, and we get a flashback. It's not explicitly said what the hammer is for, and the flashback focuses on the parents in the past. We learn there really isn't any love here, but rather it's supposed to be a working relationship when juxtaposed with the flashback where Renee, Caspian's mom, was in love with someone else. There's a level of begrudging allegiance between them. But why are they together and raising a son if they never really liked each other? It happened again. We go back to Caspian and how he relates to what we're seeing, since he's the closest focal perspective to these characters. The title cards automatically get us going to one of these emphasized characters and thinking about how events look like through their perspectives. And because of this association between Maddie, Caspian, and Chanda, the show has affirmed them as the three focal characters. And because of how seemingly central Caspian and Maddie are to the story, it's safe to assume that Chanda is too. After all, he got his own title card just like them. So imagine the surprise when Chanda gets killed in episode 2. Yes, you heard me correctly. The show killed off one of its three focal characters by the second episode. As mentioned in episode 1, Chanda's introduction is explaining UIs to investors and is trying to rise on the corporate ladder. His current boss doesn't like that and wants Chanda's skill to be used for his own gain and no one else's. So he kidnaps Chanda and zaps his brain bit by bit while he's awake to upload him and keep him working forever on his servers. It's a very gory sequence and shows the pain and process of how a human gets digitally uploaded. Since Chanda's personality, wants, desires, and all the aspects that make him are taken, and his body ends up being a corpse. Pantheon, for a sci-fi drama, is a very grounded show. It makes very clear that this could occur in the present day. People don't have superpowers or some kind of immortality. They're people, in every sense of the word. And by having Chanda die, it firmly establishes the tone of the show, and therefore, the armor our characters have. Mind you, this scene is Pantheon's most gory and horrifying sequence very early on, making sure the audience is aware that the show could go there if it wants to. And since we have this mental association between these three very mortal characters, and the show introduced and essentially killed one of the three in a very gory fashion, it makes the audience alarmed if our other two living main characters will remain alive by the end. And if the audience questions if the most important characters to the show are safe, then how is any character in the show safe? This convinces us that we're experiencing an anyone can die story. These three separate stories interwoven, and we, the observers who are safe from any consequence of this fiction, don't know if any of these characters will ever be safe. We're waiting for the other shoe to drop for so many of these plot lines. As mentioned before, there's usually a foregone conclusion. A villain that needs to be defeated, a damsel that needs saving, or something to give an understanding of what the ending of a story would look like. Pantheon has none of that. A huge part of it is how the show grounds you into believing that this is the real world. A lot of actions here are quite similar to current events going on in real life that stay true. Companies getting away with shady business practices, the rise of allegedly sentient technological beings, and how technology has impacted us in not only how we operate, but our societal dependence on it. The show makes a lot of small choices to achieve this feeling. Stephen Holstrom is the CEO of a big tech company with sleek aesthetics, developed something secretly revolutionary, and died of an illness. He has a very similar story and design to someone who passed away in the real world. Even in passing, the show mentions the COVID-19 pandemic, which was an extremely recent global event, while our characters are raiding supermarkets for supplies. These happen in the real world, and it's happened in this story too. Not only are we, the audience, experiencing an anyone can die story, we're also experiencing a story firmly grounded in what could very easily be our reality. Oh boy. And all of these plotlines are happening, for the most part, independently of one another. There are points where Caspian and Maddie tangentially intersect, and there's an event in Chanda's story that breaks the news. So for the first 5 episodes, we're viewing all of these independently with only 2 things connecting them: the company logarithms and uploaded intelligence. These 3 perspectives give a unique way of expositing information. In episode 2, Maddie and Ellen fight if David is a real person or ghost as an uploaded intelligence. We don't need to see how David was uploaded, because in the same episode, we see Chanda's gory death, so we know what happened to David when he was uploaded. Episode 5 specifically has a lot of really cool stuff. It basically gives incentive for Caspian to leave Saint Clement and call Maddie for help. And then in episode 6, we see Maddie and Caspian meet. This is a really big moment because Maddie and Caspian haven't physically interacted with one another yet. We've been viewing their plotlines separately, as if 2 sides to the televised coin. Some vague parallels, online messages, and a phone call, but now they're together in one space. This creates a very interesting effect to happen here. Maddie asks Caspian, "Are you hurt?" And we immediately take on Maddie's perspective and view Caspian as an outsider to Maddie's story. She doesn't know what happened in episode 5. She's been focused on her dad and stealing data from a big tech company. Then this scrawny goth guy appears with blood on his sweater, who could be the only chance for her to save her dad. Then we cut to Caspian in said bloody sweater, and he says, "It's not my blood." And as soon as he says that, we get into his headspace, as if Maddie is the outsider to his story. He sees the scared girl who called him a few weeks ago, frantic about her father, the person who warned him, and now the only person he can trust. As they interact with one another, this mental jump between each plotline's perspective continues, as we jump from how we understand Caspian's view of the events unfolding and Maddie's view separately. Maddie and Caspian try to normalize these events, but they keep arguing. It makes sense. They're teens dealing with what feels like the weight of the world and their own issues. Now, while this is a switch in perspective the audience typically experiences with characters, it's a genuine feat to have the audience's minds jump between these perspectives while the audience knows everything these characters know. And once he and Maddie start to open up about their shared trauma of logarithms and UI, these perspectives begin to merge. Caspian talks about how his world shifted over because of the big reveal, and Maddie speaks to her experience of losing and finding her dad again. They talk, they laugh, and this connection they make with one another seamlessly blends these two parallel stories. We're no longer seeing two separate plot lines with two disconnected characters from each other, but instead two perspectives that have officially merged into one. And since these two perspectives are ones that we've grown to trust over the course of these 6-ish episodes, there's not really a reason to feel tension between these two characters. It also means that shipping these characters is more likely, but that's another thing. The point is that Maddie, Caspian, and Chanda have all been focal characters to 3 parallel plot lines. It's an interesting experience to see how each one of them have gone from their own parallel stories to interconnecting with one another. And now, everything's okay. That is until Chanda bursts down the door. This is where a third and final major storyline begins to merge in. And this is a big moment for the show, which has kept all 3 of these stories separate. Since they did their major reveals in episode 5, this is the last card the show has to play before everything dissolves into chaos once again, for all these character perspectives to merge. This 3-pronged perspective plays a fascinating role in the season 1 finale. Long story short, Chanda becomes really sketchy, and his motives become so far removed from Maddie's storyline, he ends up becoming the ultimate antagonist of the season. This antagonistic twist for Chanda plays a massive role in the season 1 finale, which also does a lot using this element of separating these 3 perspectives into one event. To cut a longer story short, a big plot event happens where Maddie's storyline focuses on spreading the news of these amoral corporations. By revealing their plans of UIs, they're informing the public in hope that public pressure would do something to bring awareness and push against these corporations. However, the power of uploading this message is so powerful that the UI version of Maddie's dad, David, experiences a second death as he sacrifices himself to do so. Here, we get the 3 interesting looks into this one specific event. With this event occurring, Chanda has been defeated. He evolved into this antagonistic twist by the end to stop David from sending the message, because if the public knows about upload intelligence, all UIs, including him, will be hunted by the public, who will fear UIs because of a lack of understanding of what they are, and fear the powers that they have technologically. But because of the success of this event and the knowledge of UIs now being public, it means he failed to stop it. At the end of season 1, it's a bit ambiguous whether he lives or not, but the important part is that he's lost. Meanwhile, Caspian is experiencing a victory. Now that everyone knows, there's no way that logarithms who want him can have this exerted power over him, since the whole world is aware of UIs, and he believes it means that people are not going to be uploaded, since the message clearly explains the horror of the upload process. Meanwhile, Maddie is experiencing a tragedy. She lost her dad once already to illness, and she thought she'd never see him again. After a long period of isolation and not finding people to connect with, she found she could have a version of him back, and at every turn did everything she could to have him back in her and her mom's life. She made new memories with this version of him and felt happy with her father back in her life. And despite all of that, she's now lost him all over again. A copy of her father still exists in Logarithm's headquarters, but the memories she made and the version of this person he was is lost forever. It's somewhat, but also not really like a video game save file. It's 100 times more traumatic for sure. Once you save up to a certain point in the save file, you can explore and complete new achievements beyond that save point. But once you've lost all that progress, it's like it never even happened. Sure, you could redo everything you did in the quickest possible way, but the experiences you had and the memories there will never be exactly the same, which makes you question, why redo this if it's all for naught? And if that's not stressful to consider, I have no idea what is. And that's all I gotta say. See ya!